Picture this. Somewhere beneath the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, buried under miles of crushing water and sediment, lie the ruins of a civilization so advanced it makes our modern world look primitive. Towering cities with architecture that defied gravity, technologies that harnessed the very forces of nature, and a people who possessed knowledge we're only beginning to rediscover today. This isn't science fiction. This is Lemuria, the lost Pacific empire that may have been humanity's greatest achievement, erased from history in a single catastrophic moment. But here's where things get interesting. What if I told you that everything we've been taught about human civilization is wrong? What if the timeline we accept, the neat little progression from cave paintings to smartphones, is missing its most crucial chapter? What if there was a civilization that flourished for tens of thousands of years before suddenly vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only whispers in ancient texts and mysteries that modern science can't explain? Welcome to Mystery History for Sleep, where we dive deep into the shadows of our forgotten past. I'm your guide through the labyrinth of lost worlds and hidden truths that challenge everything we think we know about human history. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey that will take us from the laboratories of Victorian scientists to the mystical visions of occult masters, from the political movements of Tamil nationalism to the cutting-edge discoveries of modern geology. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about a lost continent. It's about how an idea can evolve, transform, and capture the imagination of millions across cultures and centuries. It's about the thin line between scientific hypothesis and mystical belief, between historical fact and cultural identity. And most importantly, it's about asking the question that could change everything. What if Lemuria was real? Now, before we dive into the depths of this mystery, let me give you a glimpse of what we're dealing with here. We're not just talking about some random island that sank beneath the waves. We're talking about a continental landmass that supposedly stretched across much of the Pacific Ocean, home to an advanced civilization that predates anything in our history books. We're talking about a place that different cultures have described with such vivid detail that you'd think they were reading from the same ancient manual. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. The concept of Lemuria didn't start in some dusty tome of ancient wisdom or in the fevered dreams of a mystic. It began in the most unlikely place imaginable, the rigorous, methodical world of Victorian science, and the journey from scientific hypothesis to global phenomenon is a tale that reveals as much about human nature as it does about lost continents. So settle in, because we're about to explore a mystery that spans continents, cultures, and centuries. A mystery that begins with lemurs in Madagascar and ends with the possibility that everything we know about human civilization needs to be rewritten. This is the story of Lemuria, and by the time we're done, you'll understand why millions of people across the world believe that somewhere beneath the Pacific waves lies the key to humanity's true origins. The year was 1864, and the scientific world was buzzing with new discoveries and revolutionary theories. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species had been published just 5 years earlier, turning the established order of creation on its head. Scientists were scrambling to piece together the puzzle of life on Earth, trying to understand how species evolved and spread across the globe. It was in this atmosphere of intellectual ferment that a British zoologist named Philip Sclater made an observation that would inadvertently spawn one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern age. Sclater was studying the distribution of lemurs, those distinctive primates with their large eyes and long tails. What puzzled him was a geographical anomaly that seemed to defy all logic. Lemur fossils could be found in abundance on the island of Madagascar, off the eastern coast of Africa, and also on the Indian subcontinent, thousands of miles away across the Indian Ocean. But here's what made no sense. There were no lemur fossils in the vast expanse of continental Africa that lay between these two locations, nor in the Middle East. Think about this for a moment. If lemurs had evolved in one place and then spread to others, you'd expect to find a trail of fossils showing their migration route. It would be like finding evidence of ancient human settlements in New York and London, but absolutely nothing in between. How do you explain such a distribution? How do species magically appear on opposite sides of an ocean without leaving any trace of how they got there? Sclater's solution was both elegant and revolutionary. He proposed that Madagascar and India had once been part of a much larger landmass, a continent that stretched across the Indian Ocean. This hypothetical continent had served as a bridge, allowing lemurs and other species to spread freely across what is now thousands of miles of open water. Over vast periods of geological time, this continent had broken apart, with some portions sinking beneath the waves, while others remained above sea level, as the Madagascar and India we know today. Because his theory centered around explaining the distribution of lemurs, Sclater named this lost continent Lemuria. It was a perfectly reasonable scientific hypothesis for its time, and Sclater wasn't alone in proposing such land bridges. The Victorian era was practically obsessed with these theoretical connections between continents. Geologists and biologists were discovering similarities in rock formations, plant species, and animal fossils across vast oceanic distances, and the concept of sunken continents or land bridges seemed like the most logical explanation. But here's where our story takes its first unexpected turn. Sclater's modest scientific proposal was about to be seized upon by one of the most influential scientists of the 19th century, a man whose embrace of the Lemuria theory would transform it from a simple explanation for lemur distribution into something far more profound and controversial. Ernst Haeckel was a German biologist whose influence on evolutionary theory rivaled that of Darwin himself. Haeckel was particularly obsessed with the question that Darwin's theory had raised, but not definitively answered. Where did human beings first evolve? Darwin himself believed that humans had originated in Africa, based on the presence of our closest living relatives, the great apes. But Haeckel had a different idea, and when he encountered Sclater's theory of Lemuria, he saw an opportunity to solve one of evolution's greatest puzzles. In 1870, Haeckel published his thoughts on human origins, and his words would echo through history in ways he could never have imagined. The probable primeval home, he wrote, is here assumed to be Lemuria, a tropical continent at present lying below the level of the Indian Ocean, the former existence of which in the Tertiary period seems very probable from numerous facts in animal and vegetable geography. Think about the implications of what Haeckel was suggesting. He was proposing that humanity itself had first emerged not in Africa, not in Asia, but on a lost continent that now lay beneath the Indian Ocean. This wasn't just about lemurs anymore. This was about the very origins of our species, about a homeland that had vanished beneath the waves, taking with it the earliest chapters of human history. Haeckel's endorsement gave the Lemuria theory a credibility and prominence it might never have achieved otherwise. Here was one of the world's leading scientists, a man whose books on evolution were read by intellectuals across Europe and America, claiming that our species had emerged from a lost continent. The implications were staggering. If Haeckel was right, then everything we thought we knew about human origins was incomplete. Somewhere beneath the Indian Ocean lay the true cradle of humanity, the Garden of Eden of evolutionary theory. But Haeckel's embrace of Lemuria did more than just add scientific weight to the theory. It opened the door for others to build upon the idea, to expand it beyond the realm of dry scientific speculation into something far more exciting and mysterious. And it wouldn't be long before someone did exactly that, transforming Lemuria from a scientific hypothesis into the foundation of an entirely new spiritual movement. The transformation began in the most unlikely of places, a boarding house on Sansom Street in Philadelphia, where a Russian woman with a mysterious past was recovering from a serious illness. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was unlike anyone the academic world had ever encountered. She had been a circus horse rider, a professional pianist, a businesswoman, and a spiritualist. She had travelled the world, claimed to have studied with mystical masters in Tibet, and possessed a charisma that could captivate audiences for hours. But it was during her illness in Philadelphia that Blavatsky experienced what she described as a spiritual transformation. In her fevered state, she received what she claimed were divine revelations about the true history of humanity and the cosmos. These visions would form the foundation of a new religious movement that would sweep across the Western world and transform the scientific theory of Lemuria into something far more extraordinary. Blavatsky founded the Theosophical Society, a movement that blended Eastern mysticism with Western occultism, promising to reveal the hidden truths behind all religions and sciences. At the heart of her teachings was a grand cosmological scheme that dwarfed anything science had proposed. According to Blavatsky, the history of life on Earth spanned millions of years and involved 7 distinct root races of humanity, each more evolved than the last. And here's where Lemuria enters the picture in a way that Philip Sclater could never have imagined. In Blavatsky's cosmic history, Lemuria wasn't just a continent where lemurs had lived. It was the home of the third root race of humanity, a civilization that had flourished millions of years ago when the Earth was young and magical forces still shaped reality. But Blavatsky's Lemurians weren't quite human as we understand the term. According to her elaborate mythology, they were giants, standing 15 feet tall, with 4 arms and eyes in the backs of their heads. They were hermaphroditic beings who reproduced by laying eggs, and they possessed psychic powers that allowed them to communicate telepathically and manipulate the physical world through pure will. These weren't the careful, measured hypotheses of Victorian science. This was mythology on a cosmic scale, a creation story that made the Bible look modest by comparison. Blavatsky claimed that the Lemurians had lived alongside dinosaurs, that they had built great cities and developed technologies that made use of spiritual forces unknown to modern science. They were, in her words, the first truly human race, the ancestors from whom all subsequent humanity had descended. But like all golden ages in mythology, the Lemurian era came to a catastrophic end. According to Blavatsky, the continent of Lemuria was destroyed in a great cataclysm, sinking beneath the waves and taking with it one of the most advanced civilizations in Earth's history. Only a few survivors escaped to other lands, carrying with them fragments of Lemurian wisdom that would later influence the development of human culture. Now, you might be wondering how Blavatsky could make such specific claims about events that supposedly occurred millions of years ago. Where was her evidence? How did she know these details about a lost civilization? Her answer was as extraordinary as her claims themselves. Blavatsky insisted that she had access to ancient records, mystical texts kept in hidden libraries by secret brotherhoods of initiated masters. She claimed to receive psychic transmissions from these masters, who guided her in revealing the true history of humanity. Whether you believe in Blavatsky's sources or not, there's no denying the impact of her teachings. Theosophy spread like wildfire across Europe and America, attracting intellectuals, artists, and spiritual seekers who were hungry for a more expansive view of human potential and cosmic history. The idea that humanity had once been more advanced, more spiritual, more connected to the forces of nature, resonated with people who felt that modern civilization had somehow lost its way. And at the center of this spiritual revival was Lemuria, no longer the modest scientific hypothesis of Philip Sclater, but a lost paradise that represented everything that modern humanity had forgotten. Lemuria became a symbol of what we could become again, if we could only recover the ancient wisdom that had been lost when the continent sank beneath the waves. But Blavatsky's version of Lemuria was just the beginning. The idea of a lost Pacific civilization was about to undergo another transformation, one that would move it from the mystical realm of theosophy into the realm of alternative archaeology and popular culture. And the man responsible for this transformation would create a version of the Lemuria story that remains influential to this day. James Churchward was a British-American writer and inventor who claimed to have made one of the most extraordinary discoveries in human history. According to his own account, while serving as a soldier in India, he had befriended a high-ranking temple priest who possessed a collection of ancient clay tablets inscribed in a language so old that only 2 people in all of India could read it. These tablets, Churchward claimed, contained the true history of humanity, a history that had been deliberately hidden from the world. And at the center of this hidden history was not Lemuria, but a continent he called Mu, stretching across much of the Pacific Ocean and home to the most advanced civilization the world had ever known. Churchward's description of Mu was breathtaking in its scope and detail. He claimed that this Pacific continent had been home to 64 million inhabitants, organized into 7 great cities and numerous colonies spread across the other continents. The civilization of Mu, according to Churchward, had flourished for 38,000 years before being destroyed in a cataclysm that occurred approximately 12,000 years ago. But Mu wasn't just another lost civilization. According to Churchward, it was the motherland of humanity, the original source from which all other civilizations had emerged. The great cultures of Egypt, Greece, India, and Central America were all, he claimed, colonies or offshoots of the original Mu civilization. Even more remarkably, Churchward insisted that the king of Mu had been named Ra, connecting the Pacific continent to the Egyptian sun god and suggesting a direct link between the lost continent and the mythology of ancient Egypt. The destruction of Mu, in Churchward's telling, was an event of unimaginable scope. The entire continent, covering 50 million square miles of the Pacific Ocean, had been destroyed in a series of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes that sank it beneath the waves in a single day. The few survivors who escaped carried fragments of Mu's advanced knowledge to other parts of the world, where they founded the civilizations that would later rise to prominence in recorded history. Churchward's evidence for these extraordinary claims was as mysterious as the civilization he described. Those ancient tablets he had supposedly encountered in India contained, he said, not just historical records but detailed maps of Mu's geography, descriptions of its technology, and accounts of its eventual destruction. He claimed these tablets were written in what he called the Naga language, a script so ancient and sacred that its secrets had been guarded by temple priests for thousands of years. But here's where Churchward's story becomes even more intriguing. He didn't just rely on these mysterious Indian tablets. He claimed to have found corroborating evidence scattered across the globe, hidden in plain sight in the symbols, myths, and architectural monuments of dozens of different cultures. According to Churchward, if you knew how to look, you could see traces of Mu's influence everywhere, from the stone statues of Easter Island to the pyramids of Egypt, from the temples of Cambodia to the cliff dwellings of the American Southwest. Take Easter Island, for example, those massive stone heads that have puzzled archaeologists for centuries. Churchward claimed they were memorials created by Mu colonists, marking the easternmost boundary of their Pacific Empire. The island itself, he argued, was one of the few remaining peaks of the sunken continent, a lonely sentinel standing guard over the watery grave of humanity's greatest civilization. And those strange symbols carved into rocks and cave walls across the Pacific, Churchward saw them as remnants of Mu's written language, a sophisticated system of communication that had spread across the ocean long before any currently recognized civilization had developed writing. He spent decades cataloguing these symbols, creating elaborate charts that he claimed revealed the common origin of human culture in the lost continent of Mu. But Churchward went even further. He claimed that many of the world's religious symbols and mythological stories were actually corrupted memories of Mu's true history. The Garden of Eden wasn't a metaphorical paradise, but a real place that had existed on the continent of Mu. The Great Flood described in cultures around the world wasn't a single localized event, but the collective memory of Mu's destruction, passed down through the survivors who had witnessed the sinking of their homeland. Even more remarkably, Churchward insisted that Mu's civilization had been technologically superior to our own. The inhabitants of Mu had mastered forces of nature that modern science was only beginning to understand. They could move massive stones without machinery, communicate across vast distances without technology, and harness energy sources that we've forgotten how to access. In Churchward's vision, the destruction of Mu wasn't just the loss of a continent, it was the greatest catastrophe in human history, a setback from which our species had never fully recovered. Now, you might be wondering how Churchward could make such sweeping claims based on tablets that no other scholar had ever seen. Where were these mysterious documents? Why hadn't they been studied by linguists and archaeologists? Churchward's answer was frustratingly vague. He claimed that the tablets were too sacred and fragile to be displayed publicly, that they were kept in secret temple repositories where only the most trusted initiates were allowed to view them. Critics pointed out the obvious problems with Churchward's claims. No independent scholar had ever verified the existence of his tablets. The Naga language he described bore no resemblance to any known ancient script. His interpretations of archaeological evidence were often wildly speculative, seeing connections where mainstream scholars saw only coincidence. Yet despite these criticisms, Churchward's books became bestsellers, capturing the imagination of readers who were hungry for a more exciting version of human history. What made Churchward's version of the Lemuria story so compelling wasn't just its grand scope, but its promise of human greatness. In an age when people were beginning to feel overwhelmed by the rapid pace of technological change and the apparent meaninglessness of modern life, the idea that humanity had once achieved a golden age of wisdom and harmony offered hope. If we had been great once, perhaps we could be great again. But the story of Lemuria was far from over. As Churchward's books spread around the world, different cultures began to adapt the lost continent theory to their own needs and aspirations. And nowhere was this adaptation more dramatic or politically significant than in the southern regions of India. where Tamil scholars and activists would transform Lemuria into something that its original Victorian creators could never have imagined. The transformation began in the early 20th century, as India struggled under British colonial rule and various ethnic groups sought to establish their own cultural identities in opposition to foreign domination. Tamil intellectuals, proud of their ancient language and literary traditions, were particularly frustrated by the way British and North Indian scholars seemed to dismiss South Indian culture as inferior or derivative. It was in this context of cultural resistance that Tamil writers encountered the European theories about Lemuria and saw an opportunity to rewrite the narrative of their people's origins. If there had indeed been a lost continent in the Indian Ocean, and if that continent had been the birthplace of advanced civilization, then perhaps the Tamil people were not peripheral players in world history, but the heirs to humanity's greatest achievement. The Tamil version of Lemuria, which they called Kumari Kandam, was both similar to and dramatically different from the versions proposed by Sclater, Haeckel, Blavatsky, and Churchward. Like its predecessors, Kumari Kandam was described as a vast land mass that had once existed south of India before sinking beneath the Indian Ocean. Like Churchward's Mu, it was portrayed as the home of an advanced civilization that had influenced cultures around the world. But the Tamil scholars added their own distinctive elements to the story. According to their version, Kumari Kandam had been the original homeland of the Tamil language and culture, a place where the earliest Tamil poets had composed their masterworks in great literary academies called Sangams. These Sangams, according to Tamil tradition, had been centres of learning and culture that had attracted scholars from across the known world. The political implications of this version were profound. If the Tamil people were the descendants of the Kumari Kandam civilization, then they weren't just another regional ethnic group struggling for recognition. They were the inheritors of the world's oldest and most sophisticated culture, the true founders of human civilization. Their language wasn't a provincial dialect, but the mother tongue from which all other languages had descended. Tamil scholars like Devanaya Pavanar pushed these claims even further, arguing that Tamil was not just the oldest language in India, but the original human language from which all others had evolved. According to this theory, as the survivors of Kumari Kandam's destruction spread across the world, they had carried the Tamil language with them, and over time this original tongue had been corrupted and modified to create the thousands of languages spoken today. The evidence for these claims was, like much of the Lemuria story, a mixture of linguistic speculation, archaeological interpretation, and mythological tradition. Tamil scholars pointed to similarities between Tamil words and terms in other languages, arguing that these resemblances proved Tamil's primacy. They reinterpreted ancient Tamil literature to find references to lost lands and vanished kingdoms that they claimed were memories of Kumari Kandam. They argued that certain archaeological sites in South India contained evidence of technologies and architectural techniques that were far more advanced than what conventional history would suggest. But perhaps most importantly, the Kumari Kandam theory provided Tamil culture with something that colonial narratives had tried to take away, a sense of pride and primacy. In the Tamil version of the story, they weren't the recipients of civilization from northern India or foreign conquerors. They were civilization's original creators, the source from which all human achievement had flowed. The political power of this narrative was immense. During the independence movement and in the decades that followed, Tamil politicians and activists used the Kumari Kandam story to argue for greater autonomy and recognition. If Tamil culture was indeed the world's oldest and most sophisticated, then Tamil people deserved a special place in the new India that was emerging from colonial rule. The theory became so influential that it was actually included in official educational materials. During the 1970s and 80s, schoolchildren in Tamil Nadu were taught about Kumari Kandam as historical fact. Government-funded documentaries promoted the theory, and political leaders used it to rally support for Tamil nationalist causes. But even as the Tamil version of Lemuria was gaining political traction in South India, the scientific community was making discoveries that would fundamentally challenge all versions of the lost continent theory. The revolution came not from new archaeological discoveries or linguistic analysis, but from an entirely different field, geology. In the early decades of the 20th century, a German scientist named Alfred Wegener had proposed a radical theory about the Earth's structure. Wegener argued that the continents weren't fixed in place, as scientists had always assumed, but actually moved slowly across the Earth's surface over millions of years. According to his theory of continental drift, the continents had once been joined together in massive supercontinents that had broken apart and drifted to their current positions. Wegener's theory was initially dismissed by most geologists who couldn't imagine what force could be powerful enough to move entire continents. But by the 1960s, new evidence from the ocean floors had vindicated Wegener's insights and led to the development of plate tectonics theory, which explained exactly how continents could move. The implications for Lemuria were devastating. If the continents moved because they floated on massive tectonic plates, then there was no need for hypothetical land bridges to explain the distribution of species or the similarities between distant cultures. Animals and plants could have spread from continent to continent when those landmasses were still connected, millions of years before humans existed. The similarities between cultures could be explained by migration, trade, and diffusion of ideas across existing land routes. More importantly, the new understanding of how the Earth's crust worked made it clear that continents couldn't simply sink beneath the ocean, as the Lemuria theorists had claimed. Continental crust was fundamentally different from oceanic crust, and while land could be submerged by rising sea levels, entire continents couldn't disappear beneath the waves. The scientific rejection of Lemuria was swift and decisive. By the 1970s, no serious geologist or archaeologist gave any credence to theories about lost continents in the Pacific or Indian Oceans. The evidence from plate tectonics was simply too overwhelming, and the lack of any convincing physical evidence for advanced prehistoric civilizations made the whole idea seem like a relic of a more credulous age. But here's where our story takes another unexpected turn. Just as science was definitively rejecting the possibility of lost continents, scientists began making discoveries that seemed to echo some aspects of the original Lemuria theory in surprising ways. These discoveries wouldn't vindicate the mystical or political versions of Lemuria, but they would reveal that the Earth's geological history was far more complex and dramatic than anyone had imagined. The first hints came from studies of the ocean floor around Mauritius, a small island nation in the Indian Ocean. In the early 21st century, geologists studying beach sands on Mauritius made a startling discovery. Mixed in with the volcanic minerals that made up most of the sand were tiny crystals of zircon, a mineral that forms only in much older continental-type rocks. This was puzzling because Mauritius itself was a young volcanic island, formed only about 2 million years ago when underwater volcanoes pushed it up from the ocean floor. Where could these ancient zircon crystals have come from? The answer, according to the geologists who studied them, was that they were fragments of a much older landmass that had once existed in the region, but had since been buried under millions of years of volcanic activity. Further research revealed that this buried landmass, which scientists named Mauritia, had indeed been a substantial piece of continental crust that had become separated from India during the breakup of an ancient supercontinent. Unlike the hypothetical Lemuria of Victorian science, Mauritia had disappeared not by sinking beneath the waves, but by being buried under layers of volcanic rock as the region became geologically active. The discovery of Mauritia was significant not because it proved the existence of Lemuria, but because it showed that the geological history of the Indian Ocean was far more complex than scientists had realized. There had indeed been substantial landmasses in the region that were now hidden beneath the water, though they had disappeared tens of millions of years before any advanced life forms existed on Earth. Similar discoveries began emerging from other parts of the world's oceans, revealing a hidden landscape of submerged continents and lost land masses that painted a picture of Earth's past far more dramatic than anyone had imagined. In the Pacific Ocean, scientists identified Zealandia, a massive continental fragment nearly half the size of Australia that lies almost entirely beneath the waves. Only a few peaks of this drowned continent remain above sea level today, forming the islands of New Zealand and New Caledonia. These discoveries were revolutionizing our understanding of how continents form, break apart, and sometimes disappear beneath the waves. But they were also doing something else entirely. They were proving that the basic premise underlying all the Lemuria theories, the idea that substantial landmasses could exist where we now see only ocean, wasn't completely fantastical after all. Now, before you get too excited, let me be absolutely clear about what these geological discoveries do and don't prove. They don't validate the mystical visions of Helena Blavatsky, or the alternative archaeology of James Churchward, they don't support claims about 15-foot-tall hermaphroditic giants or advanced civilizations with psychic powers, and they certainly don't prove that Tamil is the world's oldest language or that humanity originated on a lost continent. What they do prove is something far more subtle, but equally fascinating. They show us that the Earth's surface has been far more dynamic and changeable than we ever realized. They reveal that substantial land masses have indeed appeared and disappeared throughout geological history, and that the neat maps we draw of continents and oceans represent just a single moment in a constantly shifting planetary drama. But here's where things get really interesting. Because while scientists were making these discoveries about genuinely lost continents, something else was happening in the realm of popular culture and alternative archaeology. The internet age was dawning, and with it came an explosion of new theories, new claims, and new evidence for the existence of advanced prehistoric civilizations. Suddenly, every unusual archaeological discovery became potential evidence for lost civilizations. Ancient structures that mainstream archaeologists attributed to known cultures were reinterpreted as proof of much older, more advanced builders. Megalithic sites around the world were connected by elaborate theories about global prehistoric empires, and at the center of many of these theories was the persistent idea that somewhere in our past, humanity had achieved a level of technological and spiritual advancement that we had somehow lost. The internet allowed these alternative theories to spread faster and reach wider audiences than ever before. Websites, forums, and video channels dedicated to exploring ancient mysteries began connecting dots that mainstream academia insisted weren't meant to be connected. Authors and researchers who had been relegated to the fringes of scholarly discourse suddenly found massive global audiences hungry for more exciting versions of human history. And Lemuria, in all its various forms, was perfectly positioned to benefit from this cultural shift. Here was a theory that had been around for over a century, that had already been adapted by multiple cultures for their own purposes, and that offered exactly what these new audiences were looking for: the promise that human history was far more mysterious and wonderful than the textbook suggested. Modern Lemuria enthusiasts didn't just rely on the old evidence from Blavatsky or Churchward. They began incorporating new archaeological discoveries, new insights from geology and oceanography, and new theories about human consciousness and ancient technology. Some pointed to the discovery of underwater ruins off the coasts of Japan, India, and the Mediterranean as evidence that sea level changes had indeed hidden traces of advanced civilizations. Others argued that recent research into human migration patterns and the rapid spread of agriculture suggested the existence of sophisticated cultures much earlier than mainstream archaeology acknowledged. The Oniguni Monument off the coast of Japan became a particular focus of attention. This underwater rock formation, with its seemingly artificial terraces and right angles, was discovered in the 1980s and has been the subject of intense debate ever since. Mainstream geologists argue that it's a natural formation, shaped by geological processes and erosion, but alternative researchers see it as evidence of a sophisticated civilization that existed when sea levels were lower, before the end of the last ice age. Similar underwater formations have been found off the coasts of India, in the Mediterranean, and in other locations around the world. While most marine archaeologists explain these as natural geological features or the remains of known coastal settlements that were submerged by rising sea levels, alternative researchers see them as proof that advanced civilizations once flourished in areas that are now beneath the waves. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey added fuel to these theories. This massive stone complex, built over 11,000 years ago by hunter-gatherer societies, challenged everything archaeologists thought they knew about the development of complex civilizations. If hunter-gatherers could create such sophisticated monuments thousands of years before the development of agriculture, what else might they have been capable of? What other achievements might be hidden in the archaeological record waiting to be discovered? For modern Lemuria enthusiasts, Göbekli Tepe was proof that mainstream archaeology had been systematically underestimating the capabilities of prehistoric peoples. If such an advanced site could exist in Turkey 11,000 years ago, why couldn't similar or even more advanced civilizations have existed in the Pacific at the same time? Why couldn't the legends of Lemuria and Mu be distant memories of real places and real achievements? The DNA revolution in archaeology added another layer to these speculations. As scientists began tracing human migration patterns through genetic analysis, they discovered that the peopling of the Pacific had been far more complex and sophisticated than anyone had realized. The ancestors of the Polynesians had been accomplished ocean navigators, capable of crossing thousands of miles of open water to settle remote islands. Their voyages, accomplished without modern instruments or technology, demonstrated a level of seamanship and astronomical knowledge that rivaled anything achieved by later civilizations. Could these master navigators have been the survivors of a more advanced Pacific civilization? Could their remarkable seafaring abilities be the remnant of technologies and knowledge systems developed by the inhabitants of Lemuria or Mu? For believers in lost Pacific empires, the answer was obvious. The Polynesian achievement wasn't just impressive in its own right, it was evidence of a much older and more sophisticated maritime tradition that stretched back to the time of the lost continents. But the modern revival of Lemuria theories wasn't just about archaeology and DNA. It was also about a growing sense that modern civilization, for all its technological achievements, had somehow lost touch with important truths about human potential and our relationship with the natural world. In an age of environmental crisis, social fragmentation, and technological anxiety, the idea of a lost golden age became increasingly appealing. Lemuria, in its various modern incarnations, offered something that conventional history couldn't provide: hope. It suggested that humans had once lived in harmony with nature, that we had once possessed wisdom and abilities that transcended the limitations of our current scientific understanding. It promised that if we could recover the lost knowledge of Lemuria, we might be able to solve the problems that seem to be overwhelming our modern world. This spiritual dimension of modern Lemuria theories connected them to a broader movement of alternative spirituality and consciousness research. New Age practitioners began incorporating Lemurian themes into their teachings about human evolution and spiritual development. Channelers claimed to receive messages from the spirits of ancient Lemurians, offering guidance for humanity's current challenges. Crystal healers attributed special properties to stones they claimed came from the lost continent. The internet allowed these various streams of Lemuria belief to merge and cross-pollinate in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. A Tamil nationalist could discover James Churchward's books about Mu and find connections to their own theories about Kumari Kandam. A New Age spiritual seeker could encounter geological evidence for Mauritius and see it as validation for their beliefs about lost civilizations. An alternative archaeology enthusiast could study Polynesian navigation techniques and connect them to broader theories about prehistoric high technology. But perhaps most importantly, the digital age allowed ordinary people to become their own researchers and theorists. No longer dependent on academic institutions or traditional publishers, anyone with internet access could investigate ancient mysteries, propose new theories, and build communities of like-minded seekers. The democratization of information meant that the Lemuria story could continue evolving, adapting to new discoveries and new cultural needs in ways that its Victorian creators could never have imagined. And this brings us to a crucial question that gets to the heart of why the Lemuria story has proven so enduring and adaptable. What is it about the idea of a lost Pacific empire that continues to capture human imagination across cultures and centuries? Why do we seem to need these stories of vanished golden ages and forgotten wisdom? Part of the answer lies in the basic human tendency to romanticize the past. Every generation tends to believe that earlier times were simpler, more authentic, more meaningful than their own. The Lemuria story takes this tendency to its logical extreme, proposing not just that the past was better, but that it was almost unimaginably better. It offers a vision of human potential so elevated that it makes our current achievements seem modest by comparison. But the Lemuria story also serves another important psychological function. It provides an explanation for why the world seems to be full of problems and limitations. If humanity once possessed great wisdom and advanced technology, but lost them in a terrible catastrophe, then our current struggles aren't evidence of inherent human inadequacy. They're just temporary setbacks on a much longer journey toward recovering our true potential. This narrative is particularly appealing in times of social and environmental crisis. When the problems facing humanity seem overwhelming, when technological progress seems to create as many problems as it solves, when traditional institutions seem inadequate to address global challenges, the idea that we once knew how to live better becomes deeply comforting. It suggests that the solutions we need aren't impossible innovations that we must create from scratch, but ancient wisdom that we need to rediscover. The various cultural adaptations of the Lemuria story also serve important functions in terms of identity and resistance. For Tamil nationalists, Kumari Kandam provided a way to claim cultural primacy in the face of colonial and caste-based marginalization. For New Age spiritual seekers, Lemuria offered an alternative to religious traditions that seemed outdated or oppressive. For alternative archaeology enthusiasts, lost Pacific empires provided a way to challenge academic orthodoxies that seemed too rigid and narrow-minded. In each case, the Lemuria story served as more than just a historical claim. It was a tool for reimagining human possibilities, for asserting the value of marginalized perspectives, and for challenging dominant narratives about progress and civilization. Whether or not Lemuria ever existed as a physical place, it clearly exists as a powerful symbol of human aspiration and resistance. But this symbolic power also raises important questions about the relationship between belief and evidence, between inspiration and accuracy, between the stories we want to be true and the stories that actually are true. The history of Lemuria theories shows how easily scientific hypotheses can be transformed into mystical doctrines, how political needs can shape historical claims, and how the desire for meaning can override critical thinking. At the same time, the persistence of Lemuria theories also points to genuine limitations in our understanding of the past. Mainstream archaeology and geology have certainly debunked the more fantastical claims about lost Pacific empires, but they haven't necessarily provided satisfying answers to all the questions that Lemuria theories attempt to address. How did complex civilizations emerge so rapidly in different parts of the world? Why do we find similar myths and symbols in cultures that had no apparent contact with each other? What explains the sophisticated astronomical knowledge and engineering capabilities of prehistoric peoples? These are legitimate questions that deserve serious investigation, even if the answers turn out to be less dramatic than lost continent enthusiasts might hope. The challenge is to maintain both openness to new discoveries and commitment to rigorous evidence, to balance wonder with skepticism, and to recognize that the truth about human history might be even more fascinating than the most elaborate fictional alternatives. As we stand at the beginning of the 21st century, with new archaeological discoveries being made every year and new technologies opening up previously impossible avenues of research, the Lemuria story continues to evolve. Satellite imagery is revealing previously unknown archaeological sites. Underwater archaeology is uncovering evidence of coastal civilizations that were submerged by rising sea levels. Genetic analysis is tracing human migration patterns with unprecedented precision. Climate science is revealing the dramatic environmental changes that shape the development of human societies. None of these discoveries have proven the existence of Lemuria or Mu as described by Blavatsky or Churchward, but they are revealing a picture of prehistoric humanity that is far more complex and sophisticated than previous generations of scholars imagined. And this complexity leaves room for questions, for mysteries, for possibilities that we haven't yet fully explored. Consider, for example, the puzzle of rapid technological development in the ancient world. Why did agriculture, writing, and complex urban civilization emerge almost simultaneously in multiple locations around the globe during a relatively brief period between 10 and 5,000 years ago? Why do we find similar architectural techniques, astronomical alignments, and mythological themes in cultures that mainstream archaeology insists had no contact with each other? The conventional explanation is independent invention, the idea that human societies naturally develop similar solutions to similar problems. But some researchers argue that this explanation doesn't fully account for the specificity of the similarities we observe. When cultures separated by vast distances use nearly identical building techniques, when they align their monuments to the same celestial phenomena, when they tell remarkably similar stories about floods and lost lands, some investigators begin to wonder whether there might be deeper connections that we haven't yet recognized. This is where the modern Lemuria debate becomes most interesting, because it's no longer just about whether a specific continent existed in the Pacific Ocean. It's about how we understand the development of human civilization itself. Did complex societies really emerge independently in different parts of the world? Or were there earlier connections, earlier exchanges of knowledge and technology that we haven't yet discovered? Recent discoveries in underwater archaeology have added new dimensions to these questions. Off the coast of India, Marine archaeologists have found the remains of what appears to be a substantial settlement at depth that would have been dry land during the last ice age. The site, known as Dwarka, contains stone structures and artifacts that some researchers argue are far older than conventional chronologies would suggest. While mainstream archaeologists maintain that these are the remains of a known historical city that was simply submerged by rising sea levels, alternative researchers see them as potential evidence for much older coastal civilizations. Similarly, the controversial Yonaguni monument off the coast of Japan continues to generate debate. The massive stone formation, with its seemingly artificial terraces, steps and right angles, sits at a depth that would have been above water until approximately 12,000 years ago. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has argued that the structure shows clear signs of human modification, including what appear to be carved faces, symbols, and architectural features. Other scientists maintain that the formation is entirely natural, created by geological processes and erosion over millions of years. The debate over Yonaguni encapsulates the broader tensions in the modern Lemuria discussion. On one side are researchers who see evidence of sophisticated prehistoric civilizations that have been overlooked or dismissed by mainstream academia. On the other side are scientists who argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that natural processes can create formations that appear artificial to the untrained eye. But here's what makes this debate so fascinating. Both sides are operating with incomplete information. The underwater exploration of these sites is still in its early stages, limited by the enormous technical challenges of deep-sea archaeology. The tools and techniques needed to properly investigate these formations are only now being developed, and much of what lies beneath the world's oceans remains unexplored. This technological limitation means that we're still writing the early chapters of underwater archaeology. Every year brings new discoveries, new techniques, and new possibilities for understanding what lies hidden beneath the waves. The recent development of autonomous underwater vehicles, high-resolution sonar mapping, and advanced diving technologies is opening up previously inaccessible areas of the ocean floor for investigation. These technological advances are particularly relevant to the Lemuria debate because they're revealing just how dramatically sea levels have changed over the past 20,000 years. During the last glacial maximum, when much of the world's water was locked up in massive ice sheets, sea levels were more than 400 feet lower than they are today. This means that vast areas of what is now ocean floor were once dry land, potentially suitable for human habitation. The implications are staggering. Entire continental shelves that are now submerged were once coastal plains where human societies could have flourished. These areas, now lost beneath hundreds of feet of water, could have supported populations, cities, and civilizations that we know nothing about. When the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, these coastal regions would have been gradually inundated, forcing their inhabitants to migrate to higher ground, and potentially leaving behind only fragmentary traces of their existence. This scenario doesn't require the existence of super-advanced civilizations with lost technologies. It simply acknowledges that human societies have always tended to concentrate near coastlines, and that the coastlines of 20,000 years ago are now underwater. If we want to understand the full scope of human prehistory, we need to look not just at the archaeological sites on dry land, but at the vast underwater landscapes that were once home to our ancestors. Some researchers have begun to argue that this submergence of prehistoric coastlines might explain some of the persistent mysteries in human cultural development. If there were indeed sophisticated coastal civilizations that were submerged by rising sea levels, their survivors would have carried their knowledge and technologies to new locations. This could explain why we see sudden bursts of innovation in different parts of the world around the same time period, as displaced populations brought new ideas to established communities. It could also explain the prevalence of flood myths in cultures around the world. Rather than being mythological stories or distant memories of local disasters, these tales might preserve collective memories of the great inundation that occurred when the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose. The survivors of these drowned coastal civilizations would have passed down stories of their lost homelands, tales that gradually transformed into the flood myths we find in cultures from Mesopotamia to the Americas. This interpretation doesn't require us to accept the mystical elements of Theosophical Lemuria or the grandiose claims of Churchward's Mu. It simply suggests that human prehistory might be more complex and more connected than current archaeological models acknowledge. It proposes that the development of civilization wasn't a series of independent local innovations, but a global process involving the migration of peoples, the exchange of ideas, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge across vast networks of human communities. The genetic evidence for human migration patterns supports this more connected view of prehistory. DNA analysis has revealed that human populations have been far more mobile throughout history than traditional archaeological models suggested. The peopling of the Pacific in particular required extraordinary feats of navigation and seamanship that demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of ocean currents, weather patterns, and celestial navigation. The Polynesian voyagers who settled the remote islands of the Pacific possessed navigational skills that allowed them to cross thousands of miles of open ocean using only traditional technologies. They could read wave patterns, interpret cloud formations, and navigate by the stars with an accuracy that rivals modern instruments. These abilities weren't developed overnight. They represent the culmination of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and experience. Could this sophisticated maritime tradition be a remnant of even older seafaring cultures? Could the legends of Lemuria and Mu preserve memories of ancient Pacific civilizations that were more widespread and more advanced than current archaeological evidence suggests? While we can't answer these questions definitively with our current knowledge, they remain intriguing possibilities that deserve serious investigation. The DNA evidence also reveals that the Pacific was much more connected in prehistoric times than many scholars had realized. Genetic markers show evidence of contact between populations separated by vast distances, suggesting regular long-distance voyaging and cultural exchange. These connections extended not just across the Pacific Islands, but also to the Americas, Southeast Asia, and even potentially to South America, creating a vast network of maritime societies that we're only beginning to understand. This genetic evidence doesn't prove the existence of Lemuria or Mu as described in alternative archaeology texts, but it does suggest that the Pacific Ocean was a highway rather than a barrier for prehistoric peoples. It reveals a level of maritime sophistication and cultural connection that challenges simple models of isolated development and independent invention. The implications extend beyond just archaeological questions to broader issues about how we understand human potential and achievement. If prehistoric peoples were capable of such sophisticated navigation, such complex cultural networks, such advanced astronomical knowledge, what else might they have been capable of? What other achievements might be hidden in the archaeological record waiting to be discovered? These questions become even more intriguing when we consider the rapid pace of technological and cultural development that occurred during the transition from the last ice age to the modern climatic period. Within a span of just a few thousand years, human societies around the world developed agriculture, writing, complex urban civilizations, and monumental architecture. This burst of innovation coincided with dramatic environmental changes, including the melting of the ice sheets, the rise in sea levels, and the establishment of the modern climate system. Some researchers have proposed that these environmental changes didn't just provide the context for human cultural development, but actually drove it. The flooding of coastal areas would have forced populations to adapt, migrate, and develop new technologies for survival. The establishment of stable agricultural conditions would have allowed for population growth and social specialization. The opening of new trade routes as sea levels stabilized would have facilitated the exchange of ideas and innovations. In this view, the development of complex civilization wasn't just a gradual accumulation of human knowledge, but a response to a specific set of environmental challenges and opportunities. The societies that emerged from this period weren't starting from scratch, but building on thousands of years of accumulated experience, including potentially the knowledge and traditions of the coastal civilizations that had been submerged by rising seas. This perspective suggests that the legends of lost continents might contain a kernel of historical truth, even if they don't accurately describe the specific details of prehistoric civilizations. They might preserve cultural memories of a time when human societies were more widespread, more connected, and more sophisticated than current archaeological models acknowledge. They might reflect a real sense of loss, a collective memory of homelands and achievements that were literally drowned by the rising waters of the post-glacial period. The challenge for modern researchers is to investigate these possibilities without abandoning the rigorous standards of evidence that distinguish legitimate archaeology from fantasy. This means using advanced technologies to explore underwater sites, applying sophisticated analytical techniques to genetic and cultural data, and maintaining openness to unexpected discoveries while remaining skeptical of extraordinary claims. It also means recognizing that the truth about human prehistory might be stranger and more wonderful than either the conventional archaeological narrative or the alternative theories about lost civilizations. The real story of human development might involve elements that both mainstream and alternative researchers have overlooked, connections and achievements that we're only beginning to discover. As we continue to explore these underwater frontiers and develop new techniques for understanding the past, we might find that the boundary between myth and history is more porous than we thought. The legends of Lemuria and Mu might not describe literal lost continents, but they might preserve memories of real places, real peoples, and real achievements that were transformed by time, migration, and cultural change into the mythological stories we know today. The search for Lemuria, in all its various forms, ultimately represents something deeper than just archaeological curiosity. It reflects a fundamental human need to understand our origins, to connect with our ancestors, and to believe that we are part of a story larger than our individual lives. Whether that story involves lost continents with advanced civilizations or simply the remarkable achievements of prehistoric peoples working with traditional technologies, it reminds us that human history is far richer and more mysterious than we often acknowledge. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of the Lemuria story. Not that we should believe in 15-foot-tall hermaphroditic giants or psychic crystal technologies, but that we should remain humble about what we know and curious about what we don't. The past is vast and largely unexplored, and every new discovery has the potential to change our understanding of who we are and where we came from. The ocean floor holds secrets that we've barely begun to investigate. The genetic record contains stories of migration and connection that we're only starting to read. The archaeological record is constantly being revised as new sites are discovered and new analytical techniques are developed. In this context of ongoing discovery and evolving understanding, the questions raised by Lemuria enthusiasts, even if their specific answers prove incorrect, serve an important function by keeping us alert to possibilities we might otherwise overlook. The modern search for Lemuria continues in laboratories and diving bells, in genetic databases and satellite surveys, in the patient work of archaeologists and the speculative theories of alternative researchers. It continues in the stories that cultures tell about themselves, in the spiritual practices that connect people to ancient wisdom, and in the human imagination that refuses to accept that everything worth knowing has already been discovered. Whether that search ultimately validates the existence of a lost Pacific empire, or simply reveals the true complexity of human prehistoric achievement, it represents something essential about the human spirit: our refusal to accept simple answers to profound questions, our determination to push beyond the boundaries of accepted knowledge, and our deep conviction that the story of our species contains chapters we haven't yet learned to read. But as we stand on the threshold of these new discoveries, we must also grapple with a troubling pattern that has emerged throughout the history of Lemuria theories. Again and again, we've seen how the desire for extraordinary answers can lead people to embrace extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. We've watched scientific hypotheses transform into mystical doctrines, seen political needs shape historical narratives, and observed how the hunger for meaning can override critical thinking. This pattern isn't unique to Lemuria theories. It's a fundamental challenge that faces anyone trying to understand the past or make sense of incomplete evidence. How do we balance openness to new possibilities with commitment to rigorous standards? How do we distinguish between legitimate mysteries that deserve investigation and fantasy scenarios that deserve skepticism? How do we honor the human need for meaning and connection while still respecting the boundaries between what we know and what we wish were true? The story of Lemuria offers no easy answers to these questions, but it does provide valuable lessons about the dangers of uncritical belief and the importance of intellectual humility. The Victorian scientists who first proposed land bridges to explain animal distribution were working with the best evidence available to them, but they were also making assumptions about how the Earth worked that turned out to be fundamentally incorrect. When plate tectonics theory revealed the true mechanisms of continental drift, it didn't just debunk specific theories about Lemuria, It demonstrated how dramatically our understanding of basic planetary processes could change. Helena Blavatsky's mystical elaborations of the Lemuria theory show what happens when speculation becomes divorced from evidence entirely. Her 15-foot-tall hermaphroditic giants weren't based on archaeological discoveries or fossil evidence. They were products of her imagination, filtered through the occult traditions she had studied and the spiritual needs of her followers. The fact that her teachings attracted millions of adherents demonstrates the powerful appeal of grand cosmic narratives, but it also shows how easily people can be led to believe extraordinary claims based on nothing more than charismatic assertion. James Churchward's transformation of Lemuria into the Pacific continent of Mu illustrates another common pattern in alternative archaeology: the tendency to connect unrelated pieces of evidence into sweeping theoretical frameworks. Churchward saw similarities between symbols, myths, and architectural features from around the world, and concluded that they must all derive from a single source. While it's certainly possible that such similarities reflect real historical connections, Churchward's specific interpretations weren't based on rigorous analysis of the evidence. Instead, they reflected his predetermined conclusion that an advanced Pacific civilization must have existed. The Tamil adoption of Lemuria as Kumari Kandam shows how historical theories can be shaped by contemporary political and cultural needs. Tamil scholars weren't just interested in understanding the past. They were trying to establish their people's place in a colonial hierarchy that had marginalized South Indian culture. Their version of Lemuria served important functions in terms of cultural pride and political resistance, but it also demonstrates how easily historical claims can become entangled with identity politics and wishful thinking. Each of these examples reveals a different way that the desire for extraordinary answers can lead people astray. But they also point towards strategies for avoiding these pitfalls. The key is to maintain what scientists call provisional skepticism, a willingness to consider new possibilities, combined with insistence on rigorous evidence and logical consistency. This means being open to the idea that human prehistory might contain surprises, while also demanding that claims about lost civilizations be supported by archaeological, genetic, or geological evidence that can be independently verified. It means recognizing that myths and legends might preserve historical memories, while also acknowledging that stories change dramatically as they're passed down through generations and across cultures. Most importantly, it means resisting the temptation to fill gaps in our knowledge with elaborate speculative narratives. The fact that we don't fully understand how certain prehistoric achievements were accomplished doesn't mean we should assume they required lost technologies or extraterrestrial intervention. The fact that we find similarities between distant cultures doesn't mean they must all derive from a single advanced source civilization. Human beings have always been far more capable, creative, and connected than we give them credit for. The real story of prehistoric achievement, based on the archaeological evidence we actually have, is already extraordinary enough to inspire wonder and respect without requiring us to invent fictional super-civilizations to explain it. Consider, for example, the actual achievements of the Polynesian navigators who settled the Pacific Islands. These weren't the descendants of a lost continent with advanced technology. They were skilled seafarers who developed sophisticated techniques for ocean navigation using traditional materials and methods. Their ability to cross thousands of miles of open water and accurately locate tiny islands was based on careful observation of natural phenomena, wave patterns, bird behavior, cloud formations, and stellar positions. The knowledge systems they developed were incredibly sophisticated, involving complex mental maps of ocean swells, detailed understanding of seasonal weather patterns, and precise astronomical observations. But they were also entirely human achievements, developed through generations of experience, experimentation, and cultural transmission. They demonstrate what our species is capable of when we apply intelligence, persistence, and careful observation to challenging problems. Similarly, the builders of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey accomplished something extraordinary when they created their massive stone complex 11,000 years ago. The site challenges our assumptions about what hunter-gatherer societies could achieve, demonstrating levels of organization, planning, and artistic sophistication that archaeologists hadn't expected to find so early in human history. But the achievements at Göbekli Tepe don't require us to assume lost technologies or extraterrestrial assistance. They simply show that prehistoric peoples were more capable than previous generations of scholars had realized. The same principle applies to other mysterious prehistoric achievements. The precision of ancient megalithic construction, the sophistication of early astronomical observations, the rapid spread of agricultural techniques around the world. In each case, the real explanation likely involves human ingenuity, cultural exchange, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge over long periods of time. These explanations might be less dramatic than stories about lost continents and ancient aliens, but they're more respectful of human achievement and more consistent with the evidence we actually have. This doesn't mean we should stop asking questions about prehistoric mysteries or close our minds to unexpected discoveries. The underwater archaeology that's revealing submerged coastal settlements could indeed change our understanding of human prehistory in significant ways. The genetic evidence for complex migration patterns and cultural connections could force us to revise our models of how early civilizations developed. The ongoing exploration of megalithic sites around the world could uncover evidence of sophisticated prehistoric achievements that we haven't yet recognized. But it does mean we should approach these investigations with appropriate scientific caution, following the evidence wherever it leads rather than starting with predetermined conclusions about lost civilizations. It means distinguishing between legitimate mysteries that deserve investigation and speculative scenarios that go far beyond what the evidence can support. The underwater sites off the coasts of Japan and India, for example, deserve serious archaeological investigation using the best available technologies and methods. If these sites turn out to contain evidence of sophisticated prehistoric settlements, that would be a significant discovery that could change our understanding of human coastal adaptations during the post-glacial period. But we shouldn't assume they represent evidence of advanced lost civilizations until we have concrete proof that goes beyond ambiguous stone formations and wishful thinking. Similarly, the genetic evidence for prehistoric population movements and cultural connections deserves careful analysis and interpretation. If this evidence reveals previously unknown patterns of migration and exchange, it could help us understand how human societies developed and spread around the world. But we shouldn't use genetic data to support elaborate theories about lost continents, unless the evidence clearly points in that direction. The key is to let the evidence guide our theories rather than using cherry-picked evidence to support predetermined beliefs. This requires intellectual discipline and emotional maturity, the ability to live with uncertainty and incomplete knowledge, rather than rushing to embrace comforting or exciting explanations that go beyond what we can actually demonstrate. It also requires recognizing that the search for truth about human prehistory is an ongoing process, not a finished project. Every generation of researchers builds on the work of their predecessors while also correcting their mistakes and expanding their understanding. The Victorian scientists who first proposed Lemuria were working with limited evidence and flawed assumptions, but they were also asking important questions about biogeographical patterns that led eventually to our modern understanding of plate tectonics and continental drift. Helena Blavatsky's mystical elaborations were scientifically worthless, but they addressed real human needs for meaning and connection that mainstream science wasn't providing. James Churchward's alternative archaeology was methodologically flawed, but it drew attention to genuine puzzles about cultural similarities and prehistoric achievements that mainstream archaeology was perhaps too quick to dismiss. Even the Tamil adoption of Lemuria as Kumari Kandam, despite its political motivations and questionable historical claims, served important functions in preserving cultural identity and challenging colonial narratives that had marginalized South Indian achievements. Each generation's version of the Lemuria story reflected the knowledge, needs, and limitations of its time. Our own version, whatever it turns out to be, will undoubtedly reflect our own biases and blind spots as well. The best we can do is try to learn from the mistakes of previous researchers while building on their genuine insights and discoveries. This historical perspective should make us humble about our current understanding and open to the possibility that future discoveries could change our views in ways we can't currently imagine. It should also make us skeptical of claims that go far beyond the available evidence, especially when those claims seem designed more to satisfy psychological or political needs than to explain observable phenomena. The ocean floor still holds vast unexplored territories that could contain evidence of prehistoric human settlements. Satellite technology is revealing previously unknown archaeological sites on land. Genetic analysis is uncovering complex patterns of prehistoric migration and cultural exchange. Advanced dating techniques are pushing back the timeline of human achievement in various parts of the world. Any of these developments could potentially support some version of the Lemuria hypothesis, though probably not the mystical or political versions that have dominated popular culture. If substantial prehistoric settlements are discovered on now submerged continental shelves, if genetic evidence reveals previously unknown patterns of Pacific migration, if archaeological sites are found that demonstrate greater prehistoric sophistication than current models suggest, then we might need to revise our understanding of human coastal adaptations and maritime capabilities. But even if such discoveries are made, they would need to be evaluated using the same rigorous standards that apply to all archaeological and scientific evidence. Extraordinary claims would still require extraordinary proof. Alternative interpretations would still need to be tested against conventional explanations. The burden of proof would still rest on those making the most dramatic assertions. The story of Lemuria teaches us that the line between legitimate scientific speculation and unfounded fantasy is often thinner than we'd like to admit. It shows us how easily human desires for meaning, identity, and wonder can influence our interpretation of evidence. It demonstrates the importance of intellectual humility, methodological rigor, and provisional skepticism in our attempts to understand the past. But it also reminds us that the real history of human achievement is already extraordinary enough to inspire awe and wonder without requiring us to invent fictional super-civilizations. The actual capabilities of prehistoric peoples, revealed through careful archaeological investigation, are remarkable enough to challenge our assumptions and expand our understanding of human potential. The Polynesian navigators who crossed the Pacific using traditional techniques achieved something that seems almost impossible by modern standards. The builders of Göbekli Tepe created a monument that challenges everything we thought we knew about hunter-gatherer societies. The developers of early agriculture independently domesticated plants and animals in multiple locations around the world, setting the stage for the rise of complex civilizations. These achievements don't require lost continents or ancient aliens to explain them. They simply require us to recognize that human beings have always been more capable, more creative, and more connected than we often assume. They remind us that the story of our species is already filled with enough genuine mystery and wonder to satisfy even the most ambitious imagination. As we continue to explore the underwater frontiers and develop new techniques for understanding the past, we should approach these investigations with both scientific rigor and genuine openness to discovery. We should be prepared for surprises that could change our understanding of human prehistory, while also maintaining healthy skepticism about claims that go far beyond the available evidence. The search for Lemuria, in all its various forms, will undoubtedly continue as long as human beings remain curious about their origins and hungry for stories that connect them to something larger than themselves. Whether that search ultimately leads to the discovery of previously unknown prehistoric civilizations, or simply to a deeper appreciation of the achievements we already know about, it serves an important function in keeping alive our sense of wonder about the past and our commitment to understanding the full scope of human experience. The Pacific Ocean still keeps most of its secrets, and the story of human prehistory is far from complete. But whatever discoveries await us in the depths, they will be most meaningful if we approach them with the intellectual honesty, methodological rigor, and respect for evidence that distinguish genuine scientific inquiry from wishful thinking and fantasy. The true legacy of the Lemuria story might not be the validation of any specific theory about lost continents, but rather the reminder that human history is vast, complex, and full of genuine mysteries that deserve our most careful and thoughtful investigation. In that spirit of careful inquiry and open-minded skepticism, the search for truth about our prehistoric past continues, guided by evidence rather than desire, by curiosity rather than certainty, and by respect for the remarkable real achievements of our ancestors rather than the need to invent fictional ones. The waves that wash over the submerged continental shelves carry with them the sediments of countless generations, layer upon layer of earth and time that hold the secrets of our species' long journey across this planet. Whether those sediments conceal the ruins of lost civilizations, or simply the remains of the coastal peoples who were displaced by rising seas, they represent chapters of human experience that we're only beginning to learn how to read. As technology advances and our investigative capabilities expand, we may indeed discover evidence that forces us to revise our understanding of prehistoric human achievements. But whatever we find, the most important discovery will be a deeper appreciation for the complexity, resilience, and creativity of our own species. For in the end, the greatest mystery isn't whether Lemuria existed as a physical place, but how human beings have consistently managed to achieve the impossible, to adapt to changing environments, to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations, and to create meaning and beauty in a vast and often indifferent universe. The story of Lemuria, with all its scientific origins, mystical elaborations, political adaptations, and modern revivals, ultimately reflects our deepest human needs. The need to understand where we came from, the need to believe in our own potential for greatness, and the need to feel connected to something larger than our individual lives. Whether we find that connection in the ruins of an actual lost continent, or in the remarkable real achievements of our prehistoric ancestors, the search itself remains one of the most fundamentally human of all endeavours. And so we arrive at perhaps the most intriguing question of all. What if the scientific dismissal of Lemuria was premature? What if, in our rush to embrace plate tectonics and continental drift, we threw out genuine mysteries along with the fantastical claims? Because here's what's fascinating about the modern era. Just as mainstream science was definitively closing the door on lost continents, new discoveries began emerging that seemed to echo some of the original observations that had sparked the Lemuria theory in the first place. The irony is almost poetic. In 2013, a team of geologists studying beach sands on the island of Mauritius made a discovery that would have vindicated Philip Sclater's original intuition, even if it couldn't support the more elaborate theories that followed. Hidden within the volcanic sands of this young island, formed only 2 million years ago, they found something that shouldn't have been there. Ancient zircon crystals dating back nearly 3 billion years. These weren't just any minerals. Zircon forms only in continental crust, the thick, stable rock that underlies our continents. But Mauritius is a volcanic island, born from underwater eruptions in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Where could these ancient continental fragments have come from? The answer, according to the geologists who studied them, was hiding beneath their feet. Buried under millions of years of volcanic rock lay the remains of what they called Mauritia, a substantial piece of continental crust that had become separated from India during the breakup of an ancient supercontinent. Picture the implications. Sclater had been right about one crucial thing. There had indeed been substantial land masses in the Indian Ocean that were now hidden beneath the waves. The mechanism was different than he'd imagined, and the timeline stretched back far beyond any possibility of advanced human civilizations, but the basic premise that large areas of land could exist where we now see only ocean had been vindicated by cutting-edge geological research. The discovery of Mauritia was just the beginning. As oceanographers developed more sophisticated tools for mapping the sea floor, they began uncovering a hidden landscape of submerged continents and lost land masses that painted a picture of Earth's past far more dynamic than anyone had imagined. In the Pacific Ocean, scientists identified Zealandia, a continental fragment nearly half the size of Australia that lies almost entirely beneath the waves. Only the mountain peaks of this drowned continent remain above sea level today, forming the islands of New Zealand and New Caledonia. These geological discoveries were revolutionizing our understanding of how continents form, break apart, and sometimes disappear beneath the waves. But they were also doing something else entirely. They were proving that the basic premise underlying all the Lemuria theories wasn't completely fantastical after all. Substantial land masses could indeed exist where we now see only ocean, and the Earth's surface had been far more changeable throughout history than previous generations of scientists had realized. But here's where the story becomes even more compelling. While geologists were discovering these genuinely lost continents, marine archaeologists were beginning to explore a different kind of hidden landscape. The vast areas of continental shelf that had been exposed during the last ice age, but were now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water. During the glacial maximum, when much of the world's water was locked up in massive ice sheets, sea levels were more than 400 feet lower than they are today. Think about what this means. Entire continental shelves that are now underwater were once coastal plains where human societies could have flourished. These weren't tiny patches of land, but vast territories stretching for hundreds of miles from the current coastlines. When the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, these regions would have been gradually inundated, forcing their inhabitants to migrate to higher ground and potentially leaving behind only fragmentary traces of their existence. This scenario doesn't require advanced lost civilizations with crystal technologies or psychic powers. It simply acknowledges that human societies have always tended to concentrate near coastlines, and that the coastlines of 20,000 years ago are now underwater. If we want to understand the full scope of human prehistory, we need to look not just at the archaeological sites on dry land, but at the vast underwater landscapes that were once home to our ancestors. The implications become staggering when you consider the timeline. The melting of the ice sheets wasn't a gradual process spread out over tens of thousands of years. Much of it happened relatively quickly, in geological terms, with sea levels rising hundreds of feet in just a few millennia. For the human societies living on these coastal plains, it would have been a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, forcing entire populations to abandon their homes and seek refuge on higher ground. Some researchers have begun to argue that this submergence of prehistoric coastlines might explain some of the persistent mysteries in human cultural development. If there were indeed sophisticated coastal civilizations that were submerged by rising sea levels, their survivors would have carried their knowledge and technologies to new locations. This could explain why we see sudden bursts of innovation in different parts of the world around the same time period, as displaced populations brought new ideas to establish communities. It could also explain the prevalence of flood myths in cultures around the world. Rather than being purely mythological stories or distant memories of local disasters, these tales might preserve collective memories of the great inundation that occurred when the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose. The survivors of these drowned coastal civilizations would have passed down stories of their lost homelands, tales that gradually transformed into the flood myths we find in cultures from Mesopotamia to the Americas. Consider the specificity of some of these flood narratives. They don't just describe water rising, they describe entire worlds being swallowed by the sea, advanced civilizations being lost beneath the waves, survivors carrying fragments of ancient knowledge to new lands. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of a world-drowning deluge that destroys an advanced civilization, with only a few survivors preserving the wisdom of the past. Hindu texts describe the submergence of Dwarka, Krishna's golden city, beneath the waters of the Arabian Sea. Aboriginal Australian stories tell of times when you could walk to islands that are now separated by miles of ocean. These aren't vague allegories about divine punishment or moral lessons about hubris. They read like cultural memories of real places, real societies, real losses that were so traumatic they became encoded in the foundational stories of human culture. And here's what makes this possibility so intriguing. We now know that the basic scenario these myths describe actually happened. Vast coastal territories were indeed submerged by rising seas. Entire landscapes that once supported human populations are now beneath hundreds of feet of water. The challenge for modern researchers is to investigate these possibilities without abandoning the rigorous standards of evidence that distinguish legitimate archaeology from fantasy. This means using advanced technologies to explore underwater sites, applying sophisticated analytical techniques to genetic and cultural data, and maintaining openness to unexpected discoveries while remaining skeptical of extraordinary claims that go beyond what the evidence can support. The technology for this kind of investigation is only now becoming available. Autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with high-resolution sonar can map submerged landscapes with unprecedented detail. Remote-operated submersibles can explore sites at depths that would be impossible for human divers. Advanced dating techniques can determine the age of submerged materials with remarkable precision. Genetic analysis can trace the movement of human populations and reveal patterns of migration that were invisible to previous generations of researchers. These tools are beginning to reveal tantalizing hints of what might lie beneath the waves. Off the coast of India, marine archaeologists have found stone structures at depths that would have been dry land during the last ice age. The site contains walls, pavements, and what appear to be deliberately arranged stone blocks that some researchers argue show clear signs of human construction. While mainstream archaeologists maintain that these are the remains of known historical settlements that were simply submerged by rising sea levels, the discovery demonstrates that substantial human-made structures can indeed survive underwater for thousands of years. Similarly, the controversial Yonaguni monument off the coast of Japan continues to generate debate among researchers. This massive underwater formation, with its seemingly artificial terraces, steps, and right angles, sits at a depth that would have been above water until approximately 12,000 years ago. marine geologist Masaki Kimura has spent decades studying the site and argues that it shows clear evidence of human modification, including what appear to be carved faces, symbols, and architectural features that would be difficult to explain as purely natural formations. Other scientists maintain that Yonaguni is entirely natural, created by geological processes and erosion over millions of years. They point out that sandstone can fracture along regular plains, creating formations that appear artificial to the untrained eye. The debate illustrates the challenges facing underwater archaeology. Distinguishing between natural formations and human constructions is difficult enough on dry land, and the complexities multiply when dealing with sites that have been submerged for thousands of years. But here's what's significant about these discoveries. Regardless of how the debates over specific sites are ultimately resolved, they're proving that the underwater exploration of formerly dry coastal areas is revealing evidence of human activity that extends much further back in time than most scholars had expected. Even if Yonaguni turns out to be entirely natural, even if the Indian Ocean structures prove to be from known historical periods, the very fact that we're finding substantial evidence of human presence in areas that have been underwater for thousands of years suggests that our picture of prehistoric coastal adaptations is incomplete. The genetic evidence adds another layer of complexity to this emerging picture. DNA analysis of modern Pacific populations has revealed patterns of migration and cultural exchange that paint a picture of the prehistoric Pacific as a vast network of connected societies rather than isolated island communities. The ancestors of the Polynesians weren't just skilled navigators, they were part of maritime traditions that stretched back thousands of years and connected populations across vast distances. These genetic studies have revealed that the peopling of the Pacific involved multiple waves of migration, complex patterns of cultural exchange, and levels of maritime sophistication that archaeologists are only beginning to appreciate. The traditional canoe technologies that allowed Polynesian navigators to cross thousands of miles of open ocean weren't developed overnight. They represent the culmination of millennia of accumulated knowledge about ocean currents, weather patterns, and celestial navigation. Could these sophisticated maritime traditions be remnants of even older seafaring cultures? Could the legends of Pacific lost continents preserve memories of coastal civilizations that were more widespread and more advanced than current archaeological evidence suggests? While we can't answer these questions definitively with our current knowledge, the genetic evidence certainly supports the idea that the Pacific was much more connected in prehistoric times than many scholars had realized. The DNA studies also reveal something else intriguing: genetic markers that suggest contact between Pacific populations and groups from Southeast Asia, the Americas, and even potentially South America, creating evidence for a vast network of maritime societies that we're only beginning to understand. These connections extended not just across the Pacific Islands, but potentially to mainland populations, suggesting regular long-distance voyaging and cultural exchange on a scale that challenges simple models of isolated development. This genetic evidence doesn't prove the existence of Lemuria or Mu as described in alternative archaeology texts, but it does suggest that the Pacific Ocean was a highway rather than a barrier for prehistoric peoples. It reveals a level of maritime sophistication and cultural connection that supports the possibility of complex coastal civilizations that we haven't yet fully recognized or understood. The implications become even more intriguing when we consider the rapid pace of technological and cultural development that occurred during the transition from the last ice age to the modern climatic period. Within a span of just a few thousand years, human societies around the world developed agriculture, writing, complex urban civilizations, and monumental architecture. This burst of innovation coincided with dramatic environmental changes, including the melting of the ice sheets, the rise in sea levels, and the establishment of the modern climate system. Some researchers have proposed that these environmental changes didn't just provide the context for human cultural development, but actually drove it. The flooding of coastal areas would have forced populations to adapt, migrate, and develop new technologies for survival. The establishment of stable agricultural conditions would have allowed for population growth and social specialization. The opening of new trade routes as sea levels stabilized would have facilitated the exchange of ideas and innovations. In this view, the development of complex civilization wasn't just a gradual accumulation of human knowledge, but a response to a specific set of environmental challenges and opportunities. The societies that emerged from this period weren't starting from scratch, but building on thousands of years of accumulated experience, including potentially the knowledge and traditions of the coastal civilizations that had been submerged by rising seas. This perspective suggests that the legends of lost continents might contain a kernel of historical truth, even if they don't accurately describe the specific details of prehistoric civilizations. They might preserve cultural memories of a time when human societies were more widespread, more connected, and more sophisticated than current archaeological models acknowledge. They might reflect a real sense of loss, a collective memory of homelands and achievements that were literally drowned by the rising waters of the post-glacial period. The modern revival of interest in these possibilities isn't just coming from alternative archaeology enthusiasts or New Age spiritual seekers. Mainstream researchers are beginning to acknowledge that the submergence of vast coastal areas during the post-glacial period represents a significant gap in our understanding of human prehistory. If substantial populations were indeed living on these now submerged continental shelves, then we're missing crucial chapters in the story of human cultural development. This recognition has led to increased funding for underwater archaeological projects and the development of new techniques for exploring submerged sites. The European Research Council has funded major initiatives to map and explore submerged prehistoric landscapes. UNESCO has recognized the importance of underwater cultural heritage and established protocols for protecting submerged archaeological sites. Marine archaeology is rapidly evolving from a specialized subdiscipline into a major field of research with the potential to fundamentally change our understanding of human prehistory. The technology driving these advances is remarkable. Multi-beam sonar systems can create detailed three-dimensional maps of the sea floor, revealing features that would be invisible to conventional survey techniques. Sub-bottom profilers can penetrate layers of sediment to reveal buried structures and landscape features. Autonomous underwater vehicles can spend weeks mapping large areas without human intervention, collecting data that would have taken years to gather using traditional methods. These technological advances are particularly important because they're revealing just how much of the world's archaeological heritage lies underwater. Recent estimates suggest that more prehistoric archaeological sites may exist underwater than on dry land, simply because human populations have always concentrated along coastlines, and those coastlines have moved dramatically over time. The Mediterranean alone may contain thousands of submerged archaeological sites, dating from periods when sea levels were lower. But the exploration of these underwater frontiers requires more than just advanced technology. It demands new theoretical frameworks for understanding how coastal civilizations developed, how they adapted to changing sea levels, and how their cultural achievements were preserved or lost as their homelands were submerged. It requires interdisciplinary collaboration between archaeologists, geologists, oceanographers, and geneticists to piece together a complex puzzle that spans multiple fields of study. The emerging picture suggests that human prehistory was far more dynamic and interconnected than traditional models have acknowledged. Rather than isolated communities developing independently in different parts of the world, we're seeing evidence of vast networks of cultural exchange, migration, and adaptation that connected populations across enormous distances. The Pacific in particular appears to have been a zone of intense cultural interaction, rather than a barrier separating different groups. This interconnectedness might explain some of the persistent puzzles that have fueled alternative theories about lost civilizations. Why do we find similar astronomical alignments in megalithic sites around the world? Why do distant cultures share remarkably similar flood myths? Why did complex technologies like agriculture and writing appear almost simultaneously in different parts of the world? If prehistoric populations were more mobile and more connected than we've assumed, these similarities might reflect real historical connections rather than independent invention or mysterious lost super-civilizations. The genetic evidence certainly supports this more connected view of prehistory. DNA analysis has revealed that human populations have been far more mobile throughout history than traditional archaeological models suggested. The peopling of the Americas, the settlement of the Pacific Islands, the spread of agricultural technologies all involved complex patterns of migration and cultural exchange that we're only beginning to understand. These discoveries don't validate the mystical visions of Helena Blavatsky or the grandiose claims of James Churchward, but they do suggest that the basic intuition underlying many Lemuria theories may have been correct. Human prehistory was more complex, more sophisticated, and more interconnected than conventional timelines acknowledged. The challenge now is to investigate these possibilities using rigorous scientific methods rather than speculative leaps of imagination. The search for evidence of sophisticated prehistoric civilizations continues in laboratories and diving bells, in genetic databases and satellite surveys, in the patient work of archaeologists and the innovative theories of interdisciplinary researchers. Whether that search ultimately reveals previously unknown civilizations, or simply demonstrates the remarkable achievements of prehistoric peoples working with traditional technologies, it represents something essential about the human spirit, our refusal to accept simple answers to profound questions, and our determination to understand the full scope of our species' journey across this planet. As we stand at the threshold of these new discoveries, the story of Lemuria serves as both inspiration and warning. It reminds us that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, that the desire for meaning and connection can sometimes override critical thinking, and that the line between legitimate scientific speculation and unfounded fantasy is often thinner than we'd like to admit. But it also demonstrates the power of human curiosity to drive investigation and discovery, even when the initial theories prove incorrect. The ocean floor holds secrets that we've barely begun to investigate. The genetic record contains stories of migration and connection that we're only starting to read. The archaeological record is constantly being revised as new sites are discovered and new analytical techniques are developed. In this context of ongoing discovery and evolving understanding, the questions raised by Lemuria enthusiasts, even when their specific answers prove incorrect, serve an important function by keeping us alert to possibilities we might otherwise overlook. The modern search for truth about prehistoric civilizations continues, guided by evidence rather than desire, by curiosity rather than certainty, and by respect for the remarkable real achievements of our ancestors rather than the need to invent fictional ones. Whether we ultimately discover evidence of previously unknown civilizations, or simply gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity of known prehistoric achievements, the search itself remains one of the most fundamentally human of all endeavors, the quest to understand where we came from and what we might be capable of achieving.